one of my favorite quotes is from the Lutheran. I think he was a Lutheran. Yeah, he was a Lutheran. One of the founders of modern science, Johannes Kepler, and Kepler discovered the three planetary laws of motion. And he was very devout, and one of his prayers was, "I thank you, Lord our God, that you have allowed me to see the beauty in your work of creation." And that was like the attitude in the early days of science. God had created this magnificent world, and there's hidden, and there's hidden truths there that we have to unearth and dig out.
Hi, welcome to the Society of Catholic Scientists podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Keebler, your co-host, and I'm joined, as usual, with Dr. Stephen Barr, the president of the Society of Catholic Scientists, my co-host here. Steve, how are you doing today?
Doing good.
Good. Well,
Good to catch up after all of our travels.
yeah. No, it's good to be back here. I'm back in my office here on the campus of Franciscan, and today I'm thinking that we could talk a little bit about sort of the history of science and the Catholic Church. I know it's a question my students always have that come in my classes with some preconceived notions about the relationship that the church has had with science over the last millennia. And I know you've been talking and thinking about this a lot recently. So, I know that this has become an interest of yours.
Right. I had a lot of probably the same misconceptions your students had for most of my life, but, as I got into, you and I have both been doing a lot of speaking and writing about science and faith and their relationship. And of course, that brings up a lot of historical questions. And so we end up getting immersed in history. And so over the last, I don't know, 20 years or so, I've found myself doing a lot of reading on the subject, reviewing books on it, and talking to historians of science. So even though you're a biologist and I'm a physicist, I think both of us actually now have a pretty decent knowledge of the topic. So at least we're gonna fake it.
Yeah. It's one thing they say about when you get a PhD, you gotta you know certain things in depth, but the rest you just gotta fake, right? So no. One thing that has struck me is how many students come in, or how many people have this preconceived notion that the church and science have been mortal enemies, and this has been going on for thousands of years. The church has basically stood in the way of scientific discovery. Science is trying to bring us into this enlightened worldview, and the church is trying to suppress it. And they always, without fail, point to the Galileo episode as a quintessential example of this history. What's wrong with that view?
Well, they have a point about the Galileo case,
Yeah.
though the facts of that case are much more complicated than most people understand. But maybe we can have a future episodes just about the Galileo case. It's so interesting and so complicated. But on the larger point, they're wrong. The idea, this idea that historically you had the Catholic Church and Christianity in general sort of opposing science and conflict with science. And the idea that there were actually two warring camps. There was the camp of the religious people and the camp of the scientific people, and that they were constantly battling each other. That's called by historians of science the conflict thesis or the warfare thesis. And as you said, it's almost everyone seems to believe it. That's my impression. Everyone you talk to, whether you're talking to academics, professors, talking to the man on the street, everyone seems to have this view. I shared it to some extent when I was younger, didn't know any better. But and even historians in the past, once there was a time when even many historians also had this view. But I would say for a long time now, real historians of science just reject it as completely false and regard it as a myth, as they call it the conflict thesis, and they regard it as really completely a myth.
Yeah. So if it is a myth, right, and that's not representative of that conflict thesis, where does this originate from? What got this myth started, and what has given it its legs?
Yeah, well, you don't want to oversimplify, and there are many things that contribute to it. But the historians themselves, historians of science, trace it back. Say it really, as you say, got its legs. It really became widespread in the late 19th century, and largely through the influence of two books,
Okay.
uh, both written by American authors, though I think one of them was born in England. I always get the names of these books wrong. One of them was written by a fellow named John William Draper in 1874, and his book was called History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. And then there was a book 20 years later, 1896, by a guy named Andrew Dixon White. He was actually the first president of Cornell University.
Okay.
And his book was called, had a similar title, A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. Now, these books were enormously popular and successful. They've never gone out of print. They've been translated into numerous languages. And in these books, Draper and White try to support their thesis of a conflict, a warfare between science and religion, with lots of historical examples and anecdotes. And so actually, they generated not just the overall myth, but many of the little myths,
Okay.
little stories that people have heard that sort of are part of the larger myth. But historians regard virtually all, if not all, of these little myths and examples that they use are rejected by historians as large, it's just nonsense, as either false or gross distortions of the actual history. So the historians regard these books as of really unscholarly and almost devoid of historical merit.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but they had vast influence.
Right. Yeah. So they have vast influence in affecting the way people think about science and faith. So, what are some examples of things that they claim, like in these books, that really, said modern historians of science have debunked?
Yeah, there's a lot. One of probably the most well known, the one you hear most often, is this idea that the Catholic Church, in particular, uh, taught that the Earth was flat, and had
Okay.
taught this since ancient times, and taught it until Columbus, showed that the world was round, and in fact that the church authorities, theologians in Spain, had opposed the idea of supporting Columbus's voyage because they thought the world was flat, and
It's
so
going to
his
fall off the
voyage
end of the world or
is
something.
all the end of the world, so that they opposed funding his voyage. But actually, everybody knows, all people who know any history know this is completely nonsensical. It's really kind of silly because all educated people since ancient times, since the Greeks and the Romans, all educated people knew that the Earth was a sphere. And that included all the leaders, the early church fathers, the leaders of the Catholic Church from antiquity through the Middle Ages, St. Thomas Aquinas, all the great theologians of the Middle Ages, all down to the time of Columbus. They
Yeah.
all knew the Earth was around. What they were fighting about, what they were arguing, not fighting, what they were arguing about when it came to Columbus was not whether the Earth was flat or round. It was how big is the Earth? How they all
Oh,
agreed it was a sphere, but how big was it? That's sort of comical. But you even find people today. I think actually President Obama made reference to this, that that they thought the world was flat until Columbus.
yeah.
Um, it's
Yeah. It's
another one
right.
that's really kind of funny. I mean, a couple. Well, this one is not so funny, but a very widespread idea is that not just the Catholic Church, but the churches opposed the use of anesthetics for childbirth. And they did so because the book of Genesis had said that as a result of the
Oh, yeah.
fall
Yeah.
of Adam and
Yeah.
Eve, that women would give birth, in pain, that they would have pains in childbirth. And therefore, the Christian churches have said, no, you shouldn't interfere with this. You shouldn't use anesthetics. There is no truth to it. No churches oppose the use of anesthetics for childbirth. That's a complete fabrication. Another one that's kind of weird is that, but again, widespread, is that the Catholic Church opposed the dissecting of human bodies, and that medical science was set back by the church's opposition to doing dissections of cadavers, as part of medical research. But again, it actually this was actually, like many of these stories, is actually upside down. Most cultures in the world, I learned this from a very nice book by James Hannam. Most cultures in the world were opposed to dissecting. They thought deceased humans' remains should be treated with great respect, and it was sort of taboo to do things like dissecting them. It was in dissections for medical purposes first happened in Italy in the 13th century, it was approved or tolerated by the church. So it was kind of upside down. The one that's kind of funniest, and I don't know for sure this goes back to Draper and White, but one of my colleagues in my physics department told me that the Christian churches had opposed lightning rods because lightning was supposed to be like God's punishment, like the thunderbolts of Zeus.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And you shouldn't interfere with that by try to ward them off with using lightning rods, because that would be blasphemous. Again,
I've never heard that one.
I had never heard that one either. I have not checked, but it's the kind of thing that Draper and White propagated. I would be willing to bet that also goes back to their book. But there's a lot of these little stories out there that Draper and White promoted and have got it into the culture,
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up dissection and like human dissection and how it actually sort of gets a start in the Middle Ages and medieval times, because there is this, again, I think it's probably part of the conflict thesis there that's wrapped up in it, that the church in the Middle Ages was suppressing science, and it wasn't until the Enlightenment and the Renaissance that things took off. But here, you're saying it's the exact opposite. The church was actually supporting or allowing scientific research, the dissection of cadavers. So, does that notion, and a lot of people have this, that the medieval times was backwards, dark, the Dark Ages, the church was making them dark, and it wasn't until you sort of escaped the clutches of the church that science and the Enlightenment flourished. That's
a big part. That is a big part of the so-called conflict thesis. Actually, some of them even go back further. And but yes, so the whole idea of the Dark Ages also, actually, modern historians tend to avoid that term because there was a period you might call darkness from the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, around 476 AD, people say, but from around 500 AD to about 1000, things were at a pretty low level in Europe. The empire had collapsed. There was very little commerce or trade or economic activity. Cities had sort of dwindled, and things were at a very low level in every way. But actually, around what's now called the High Middle Ages, from 1000 to maybe 1300, was a period of tremendous revival. This was a period of great, even technological growth. A lot of historians have pointed out that the economy, really boomed at that time. Population grew, cities began to grow, and this is the time of the great cathedrals were built, and so on. And so, so the Middle Ages was actually not this stagnant, dark period that people imagine. And so it's true that, like everything, these myths have a little grain of truth in them.
Yeah.
So it's true that relatively little science was done in even the High Middle Ages compared to what happened later in the scientific revolution, But nevertheless, a lot more. Now it's realized that a lot more science was being done in the Middle Ages than people had realized, and some of it quite impressive and creative. And so, for example, there were some really impressive figures doing groundbreaking work in the Middle Ages. And I mentioned, interestingly, all of them, or almost all of them, were either bishops or priests. So St. Albert the Great, who's pretty
Hmm.
well known,
Yeah.
was a bishop. You had Jean Buridan, who was a priest and a professor at the University of Paris. You had another bishop named Nicholas Oresme, who was actually kind of a universal genius. He made contributions in many fields, from economics to physics to math to musicology and so on. But he was did some very impressive stuff in science. But there were others too: Roger Bacon, Thomas Bradwardine, and so on. So there was a lot actually going on in the Middle Ages. So I'll just give a couple examples.
Okay.
Um, so there's a fellow named, I told you about, Jean Buridan, who was a professor at the University of Paris and a priest. He came up with this idea of what he called impetus, which is essentially the same as the modern physics idea of momentum. So he said there was a quantity that was conserved, that if it was imparted to an object, it kept that object continuing to move. So it was
Yeah.
kind of
Right.
conserved.
Okay.
And he called it impetus. He said it was dependent on the mass of the object and its speed, which is correct. Another so I mentioned Oresme, the bishop of Lisieux in France. Oresme he was the first person to graph a physical quantity. And anyone who knows science knows that the use of graphs is ubiquitous in science. It's like one of the main tools in science. And the first person to graph a physical quantity, to have the idea, was Nicholas of Oresme, this bishop, and he graphed velocity as a function of time and other things, and and he had other, really made some rather startling ideas in mathematics. He had ideas that were well in advance of his time. I mean, I could go on with other examples, but it was not this period of total stagnation.
Stagnation. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. And that's what you would expect at the base of sort of the scientific tree, that there would be, little bits and pieces as you're sort of building science up, and then it explodes after you've got enough knowledge. It's got
Right.
the parallel. So what is, how much of this, the stuff that's going on in the Middle Ages, did that influence and lay the groundwork, right? For,
Right.
again, the groundwork being done by a lot of Catholics, Catholic bishops and so forth, as you say,
Yeah.
lay the groundwork for later, further expansions of science.
Well, it's hard to know about specific ideas or
Yeah.
developments in medieval science. It's hard to know how much they influenced people later, like Galileo, the figures of the scientific revolution, because people in those days were not always very careful about giving credit to their predecessors. Even today, scientists
Yeah. Yeah.
often fail to reference people they got ideas from, but in general, that wasn't done in those days. So it's hard to know. But for example, the Galileo. So the idea of what's called uniform acceleration, for those who are physics buff, that's a very subtle idea, which actually developed in the Middle Ages. The idea, this concept of uniform acceleration,
Okay.
and that may have influenced people like Galileo, but certainly it seems very strong case that Oresme, I mentioned, he graphed velocity as a function
Velocity.
of
Hmm.
time, and there are very similar graphs that Galileo appear in Galileo's works. And though it can't be proved, I think a lot of people believe that Oresme's works would have been available to Galileo. That believe that did influence him, um, I mean, there are other ways that there's indirect influence. So, for example, spectacles were invented in the Middle Ages in the 13th century, um, and that had an effect because eventually it was spectacle makers in about the year 1600 who invented telescopes and microscopes. So
Yeah.
the medieval developments actually, bore fruit later. But the biggest, unquestionable effect that medieval science had for later science was the inventing of universities.
Right.
This was really a vital development. So, what we call universities were invented really in medieval Europe in the 11th, 12th, 13th century. You had the University of Bologna and Oxford and Paris and so forth. Um, and Padua and Salamanca and so on. By the end of the Middle Ages, there were 100 universities in Europe. And in these universities, science was taught. It was a very important part of their curricula. It's called science in those days. Actually, science wasn't called science until the 19th century. But science, generally called natural philosophy back then, and it was actually in the medieval universities a prerequisite to studying theology. That's how important it was.
Okay.
And so these universities, they really produced the scientific community and the scientifically educated public that were kind of necessary for science to really blossom. I mean, a very important historian of science named Edward Grant, and he was not a Catholic, and he was very highly regarded in his field. He said that it was in the medieval universities that for the first time in human history, science was given an institutional foundation. As he said, science was institutionalized for the first time. And so it was taught and practiced and taught by a stable community of scholars, from year to year, generation to generation. And that bore fruit, really.
Give it a permanent home that it continues to have to this very day, right?
Right.
And those universities were born out of the church, right? In many sense.
Right.
So once we get past sort of the Middle Ages, the founding of these universities, and the beginnings of sort of science that you've talked about, part of the myth is that the church got out of the way and the scientific revolution took off, partly sort of leaving the church in the dust in the background.
Yeah.
But talk about why that part of the myth is wrong.
Right. That's the thing. As you said earlier, there's this thought that there was the church and was suppressing science, trying to keep it down, and only when these brave rebels against religion and against dogma and orthodoxy, all this stuff, these brave rebels sort of broke the chains of religion, did science spring forth. But that's completely, again, it's kind of upside down. Because if you look, when was the scientific revolution? Well, science really sort of took off. You sort of kind of exploded in the 1600s. It was sparked. Many people think that explosion was sparked by Copernicus. So he was in the mid or to late 1500s. Now, look at who these people were. So Copernicus, who many say started the ball rolling, changed the metaphor. He was an official of the Catholic Church, educated in universities that had been founded in the Middle Ages. He was an official of the Catholic Church, probably not a priest, but he had some sort of minor orders, perhaps. But anyway, he was an official. Then you come to the 1600s. You have Tycho Brahe, Kepler, Galileo, Descartes, Pascal. Robert Boyle, the founder of chemistry, father of chemistry, Isaac Newton. If you look at the top names in the 1600s, the people who sort of built science, every single one that I can find was a Christian, either Catholic or Protestant in equal numbers, roughly, but not an atheist among them. I have not found any. Every one of the great names of the 1600s was a Christian. They didn't see themselves as rebelling against religion. Quite the opposite. The scientists of the scientific revolution, they actually saw their work as a way of giving glory to God because they were discovering hidden beauty in God's creation. So anyway, that's. But when you talk about the church, an interesting thing is a number of these great scientists of the scientific revolution were Catholic priests. And we can talk about some of them if you like. They're really quite impressive figures. But the fact that they were Catholic priests and that most of the scientists of the Middle Ages were priests and bishops.
Yeah, right.
That tells you something about the attitude of the church, right? I mean, because if the church were hostile to science or afraid of it and trying to suppress it, why would they allow the clergymen to spend a lot of their time doing scientific research?
Right.
So
Yeah.
something doesn't
Something doesn't add up there for sure.
something doesn't add
Yeah.
up.
Yeah. So, someone could argue, the church maybe just tolerated science, let the priest, but what is it about, is there a sort of active institutional
Yeah.
support that the
Well,
church
I mean,
gave that would say that they didn't just tolerate it, they promoted it, right?
well, yeah. So that's right. So it wasn't just tolerating. In fact, the universities are partly built. So in the Dark Ages, like up until the year 1000, when
Yeah.
everything was at a pretty low level, the Europeans didn't have access to the scientific writings, or many of the scientific writings of the ancient Greeks, and so when they got access to them, from the Arabs or from the Byzantines, they wanted to translate them into Latin, which is what educated people spoke at that time, and so there was a huge effort to translate all ancient scientific works
Okay.
into Latin. And it was largely, this was actually it was partly to study this recovered wisdom of the ancients that the universities were built, founded. And these were Catholic institutions. As I said, these were Catholic institutions very closely tied to the church. And as I said, science, it was mostly the science of ancient Greece, but it was the science was a very important part of its curriculum. So that's one measure of the sort of institutional support. The clergy was just as interested, hungry for this kind
Yeah.
of knowledge as the laity. So it was definitely the church. Um, I would like to mention a few of the scientists of the scientific revolution. That were Catholic priests. So because they were really quite impressive. So one of them was a fellow named Marin Mersenne, and he was one of the founders of the science of acoustics. He was the first person to measure the speed of sound. He did work in designing reflecting telescopes. He did a lot of things, but he was also kind of the center of the hub of communications among scientists. That was the way scientists learned
Yeah.
about each other's work. And Mersenne was really critical of that. In fact, I have a quote here. So there's a historian named Heilbrunn, J.I. Heilbrunn. No, not Heilbrunn. It was another guy who said that. No, I'm misquoting. Heilbrunn is another guy I want to quote. But there was a historian who said that I think his name is Bernstein. He
Okay.
was Peter Bernstein, who said that Mersenne was the center of the world of science in the early 1600s. He was the center of the world of science, and he was a Catholic priest of an order called the Mennonite order. Another guy, I only learned about this guy like 10 years ago. His name was, and too, Nicholas Stenson, or Steno.
Mhm.
And
Right.
he's the founder of, regarded as the founder of geology and also the study of fossils and so forth. And he was a Catholic priest. Another very important guy. Well, another guy. Let's see. I want to leave anyone out, but maybe we can talk about more of them later. But again, the fact that clergy were involved so heavily, and not just Catholic clergy, there were many Protestant clergy, for example, also involved in scientific research, and that shows the attitude of the churches as institutions. That they saw this as a fitting activity for their
Yeah.
clergymen.
Yeah. So you talk about the clergy. There was also religious orders that were very active. That put a considerable amount of resources. In particular, I read about the Jesuits and their role in. You read about the Galileo Fair, and there's astronomers who are Jesuits that are interested in astronomy and so forth. So they had a big sort of active role in astronomy and sort of calendar development. And so you could talk a little bit about that and sort of
Right. So the Jesuits have a very glorious history in science. So especially in astronomy. In fact, the Jesuits got involved in astronomy shortly after the order was founded. I think it was founded maybe in 1540 or something. But they already, within years of that, they were already Jesuits doing scientific, astronomical work. And so many of the top astronomers of the 1600s, this is the scientific revolution, many of the top astronomers were Jesuit priests. They were highly regarded. And as you said, the calendar we use today was basically developed by the Jesuits, based on other people's work also, but developed by the Jesuits. And it's called the Gregorian calendar because it was promulgated by Pope Gregory. I forget, was it the 12th? I forget. Anyway, Pope
Okay.
Gregory.
Yeah.
But based on the work of Jesuit astronomers. But so, for example, just to name three really significant astronomers of that time, you had Francesco Grimaldi. Now, I find him very interesting because he just made a major discovery in physics. Any of your physics buffs who are listening or watching will know about something called diffraction. It's really a very important phenomenon in physics. It was discovered by this Jesuit priest in the 1600s, Francesco Grimaldi. Riccioli was another. He was actually the teacher of Grimaldi. I think he was a Jesuit astronomer. Did lots of important work. One thing he did, he actually discovered what we now call the Coriolis effect.
Wow.
Another one was Christoph Scheiner, was a Jesuit who did a lot of studies of sunspots. He was one of the co-discoverers of sunspots at that time. So they have the Jesuits have a very glorious history. And as you said, during the Galileo affair, the church authorities, consulted these Jesuit astronomers.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, it's true that the church, you can't deny the fact the church authorities blundered, big time.
Yeah.
But it wasn't out of hostility to science. They had great respect for science, and they asked the Jesuit astronomers their opinions and what they thought about the whole subject. So it wasn't some kind of hostility to science. Whatever else it proved, it didn't prove that. But I want to mention the Jesuits. It's not just in the 1600s, but all the way down to the present day. So I read that around the time of the American Revolution, 1/4 of all the astronomical observatories in the world were operated by the Jesuit order. And even today, we have the Vatican Observatory, which does significant, good scientific research, and it's staffed. The Vatican Observatory is staffed by Jesuit priests, and you and I know some of these priests.
Right.
Actually, a number of them are members of the Society of Catholic Sciences. So
that's right.
It's a glorious tradition and not just astronomy. This is something I learned from one of my colleagues who's an astrophysicist. I didn't know this. One of the founders of astrophysics was a Jesuit priest in the early to mid 19th century named Angelo Secchi.
Okay.
He actually, the way astrophysicists classify stars nowadays is actually based on an original classification scheme that Secchi developed. So, and this is known to all astrophysicists. They all know who Secchi was.
That's interesting. Yeah. And I learned at one of our conferences, we had someone talk about how the Jesuits are sort of the fathers of the seismology and understanding earthquake was the Jesuit science because of their locations throughout the globe and their interest in it. So there's another connection.
That's right. And that we had this young woman who's a grad student at Harvard, Natasha Tagramachian, and she gave this wonderful talk at one of our conferences on seismology. And it's interesting, seismology. It's really important that you have seismic stations widely distributed on the planet. So because you want to, see the seismic waves from many different positions to get a sense of what's going on. And so in many parts of the world, Japan and China and South America and other far-flung places, the first seismic observatories were set up by Jesuit missionaries back in, Jesuits were going to those places already in the 1500s. So what they did is they would set up seismic observatories all around the globe. And so that's why, as she said, and I'd never heard this, seismology is sometimes called the Jesuit science.
Yeah.
So there's such a amazingly rich story here. I mean, it's not just that. So even these missionaries, not just Jesuits, but there were all sorts of religious orders and missionaries around the globe back when, people were first sailing the seas and making, the explorers were discovering all these places. And they would be sending back studying the priests, missionaries, be studying the flora and the fauna of these places. They were, and the geology and the topography, and they sending back specimens to Europe. And so there was a lot, just wealth of scientific information flowing into Europe from Catholic missionaries. So
Yeah,
there's so many aspects to the story.
no, it's almost an embarrassment of riches here as you
Yeah,
look at this. And how does this continue up to the present time? Because it wasn't, it's not
yeah,
as if this stopped, but you also even have
right,
this in the 20th century, right? And in Catholics represented in science and the church interested in science, right?
right, right. So so I mentioned, already, in the 19th century, you had
Right.
Secchi being one of the founders of astrophysics, but even in the 20th century, well, Gregor Mendel, that he's one of the few who everybody other than
Everybody knows. Yeah.
everyone's heard of, and
Yeah.
he was, the late 1800s, late
Mhm.
19th century. He
Right.
really is considered the father of the science of genetics, but even in the 20th century, so this is now increasingly well known. But there was a time, 10 years ago, when very few people had heard of this. The founder of the Big Bang Theory, the central pillar of cosmology, of our study of the universe and how it began and how it was developed over 14 billion years. The Big Bang Theory was proposed by a physicist and mathematician who was also a Catholic priest, Georges Lemaitre. And so even in the 20th century, you have an entire, a branch of science, a very
Yeah.
important
Yeah.
branch of science
Very.
being founded really. Well, I mean, he was one of the founders of modern cosmology, but there's just many, Catholics, mostly lay people, obviously, but even including some priests who are at the cutting edge of research in the 20th century and the 21st century. So this isn't just something from, it's true that if you go back, it's not too surprising that, say, in the Middle Ages or even in the 1600s, that a lot of the scientists were priests. I mean, that does reflect the church's attitude towards science.
Yeah.
But of course, many of the clergy were active in all sorts of intellectual fields, both Catholic and Protestant clergy. But now, of course, things are so specialized that, it's very hard.
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
Usually it's very hard to go into science as a serious researcher unless you're devoting full time. And so it's kind of hard for priests, clergy to do that. And of course, society is much more secular.
Yeah.
But even in the 20th and 21st century, we have a lot of clergy involved in scientific research. So we have,
Yeah. Like at universities and university settings, you see a lot of that.
right,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
right. So this story, is going on, but I always plug our website. So like, as you said, when we talk to young people, we find, or older people, we find this myth, this idea that sort of religion and science are like oil and water; they don't mix. That religion has been hostile to science, all this kind of stuff. And I sort of swallowed that when I was younger. I sort of accepted it because
Everybody
sort
said
of
it. That's what you heard from every corner.
it's
Yeah.
every corner you hear that from everywhere, and then over time, I began to notice. I just come as I said, one of my colleagues told me, astrophysics colleagues told me about Secchi, and then I learned I saw in a Newsweek article like 30 years ago that the first asteroid had been discovered by an Italian priest,
Wow.
Giuseppe Piazzi, and he was not a Jesuit. He was a member of, I think, the Theatine order. And wow, I didn't know that. The first asteroid discovered by a priest
Interesting. Yeah.
who was also a professional astronomer. And I pick up these little, and then I learned from someone maybe 15, 20 years ago about this blessed Nicholas Steno in the 1600s, who had, what really could be credited as sort of the father of geology.
Yeah.
And
Right.
over time, I began to wonder. And so I began to realize there's something going on here. And so we actually have a feature on our website of the Society of Catholic Scientists called Important Catholic Scientists of the Past. And so I worked on this with another fellow, Andrew Cassabaum. And we actually, by now, we have, I think, 99, but soon to be over 100 scientists from all the way from the Middle Ages up to through the 20th century of important Catholic
Right.
science. These
Yeah.
are people who really made a mark on science. Things are named after them. They're in the textbooks, and I was bowled away. I mean, if you look through the names of these 100, and we have bios of all of them on the website. If you look through the names, I mean, I don't care what field of science you're in, you're going to be stunned at how many of the big names in the history of your field are in this list as practicing, believing Catholics. And
Yeah.
so I now realized, and nothing I think that the standard narrative is just, it's not just wrong. It's like a complete inversion of the
Yeah.
truth.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's funny you talk about that narrative and this complete inversion because you start to hear, like in Catholic circles now, I've seen, people saying that science really owes its origin to Christianity or the Catholic Church, and then you have
Yeah.
some people that make that claim that without the Christian West, science would have never gotten off the ground. But at the same time, you also have, there was a lot of, very good science being done in the Muslim world in the first millennia, and a lot of those books, as you mentioned, were translated into Latin so that people could learn and advance that science of optics and math and
Right.
so forth. Then there was all this contributions, made by the ancient Greeks and some of the Romans
Right.
to science. So what's
Yeah.
what's your take on that? What do historians say in terms of like, because clearly I think it's pretty unambiguous that the church did not suppress science, did not
Right.
put a roadblock up to it. But is it the church responsible in a way that, or Christianity for modern science, or is
Yeah.
that
Well,
too strong of a thesis there, in your
it's
opinion?
hard to, there are people, for example, Stanley Yaki, who's a very popular
Right.
author, Catholics, and he had a PhD in physics. He was a Benedictine priest, and he was more a historian of science. And he would make very strong claims that, if it hadn't been for Christianity, we wouldn't have, what we call modern science at all.
Yeah.
There wouldn't have been a scientific revolution. I think that's a pretty strong claim, and I think a pretty dubious claim. I mean, as you say, enormous amount was done by the ancient Greeks, who were pagans, and the heyday of ancient Greek science was, the 200, the 300s, and BC. It sort of faded. It was in Athens mostly,
Yeah.
not just Athens, but Archimedes was in Sicily. But ancient Greek science had sort of faded its luster by the time of the birth of Christ. It had already faded. Some people blame Christianity. This is another part of the myth that ancient Greek science was somehow displaced by Christianity. But that's crazy because Christianity only became a force to be reckoned with, influential like 200 or 300 years after Christ. And ancient Greek science was really not much on the scene by that time.
Yeah. Right.
But anyway, the Greeks made enormous contributions, and they were pagans. So it's hard to say, and you can't turn the tape of history back and say, what if you didn't have Christianity? What would
Right.
happen?
Yeah.
So I think those claims are exaggerated. But it's certainly interesting that the scientific. So the Muslims did some very interesting things. You said in the first millennium, especially, but and the Greeks before that and others. But really, science didn't really get going and stay going, until really the scientific revolution. That was when it all took off in a big way. And that happened in a part of the world that was not only that was culturally Christian.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
and there are aspects of Christian belief that many you can point to that are conducive to doing science, that encourage a certain mentality or outlook that would be conducive to pursuing science. But as far as whether science wouldn't have happened without it, I get a little. I think that may be going too far, a bit too
It's
far.
too far. Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't think now, of course, science has become global. It started in Europe, and then maybe around the beginning of the 20th century, it started to spread to other parts of the world. So now it's a truly global thing.
Right.
and you have people of all cultures. You have a lot of atheists, a lot of people who are, from non-Christian cultures. You have all sorts of different beliefs, and that's one of the glories of science is you don't have to have any specific set of religious or political or other beliefs.
Right. Yeah.
All you need is reason, and reason is a God's gift to all human beings.
Human, yeah, all can take place in it. Although you do need to have a certain amount of societal support, right? And that's the thing. So, well, like you said, while you didn't have science in the 600 and 700s in Europe, that you didn't
Right,
have the resources in place, and so there's an aspect of how much the resources were in place in the Christian West
right.
at
And
the Middle Ages.
exactly,
Yeah,
you had the resources. Also, science was probably regarded as not terribly useful for most of human history. I mean,
yeah,
people, but no one could foresee the vast economic benefits and
yeah, right, exactly.
that it would bring, health benefits and so on. So no one could have dreamt of that, probably even in the 1600s. So I think a lot of it was done just to understand the world better. It was a thirst to understand
Yeah,
God's creation. It was a desire
sure.
to understand this world that God had created. And one of my favorite quotes is from the Lutheran. I think he was a Lutheran. Yeah, he was a Lutheran. One of the founders of modern science, Johannes Kepler, and Kepler discovered the three planetary laws of motion. And he was very devout, and one of his prayers was, "I thank you, Lord our God, that you have allowed me to see the beauty in your work of creation." And that was like the attitude in the
Yeah,
early days of science. God had created this magnificent world, and there's hidden, and there's hidden truths there that we have to unearth and dig out, and
yeah,
to manifest the greatness of God's creation.
yeah.
So that was one of the ways in which religion certainly fostered
Yeah, it
science.
says science found a friendly home
Yeah,
in a Catholic or Christian West, and maybe it could have found a friendly home elsewhere, but it certainly found a friendly home, like as you said, because of that there.
right.
So
Yeah,
that's
that's
great.
a good way to put it. Yeah,
Yeah, then that's a good place to end right there. I think
yeah,
about this tour through a quick tour through the sort of the history and the problems with the myth of conflict between Christianity and the Catholic Church in particular and modern science. So thanks, Steve. Appreciate having you on. And
and we'll have to come back and go into more deep depth on some of the things like the Galileo case, which I think
yeah,
a
we
lot.
definitely that would be a great to have to have a guest on to do that episode.
Yeah.
That'd be excellent. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Catholic Scientist podcast, sponsored by the Society of Catholic Scientists. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, and you can also show your support by donating to the society to help us produce content like you just heard. You can donate by going to our website at catholicscientist.org and clicking on the donate button. You can also find other useful resources, articles, and videos on our website.